Hello and welcome to another edition of Frost Over the World. Most of the week's headlines have, of course, been dominated by the Middle East, and later in the programme I'll be talking to Sami Kiami, the Syrian ambassador to the UK, and discussing the hostage standoff between Iran and Britain. But first, we turn to the United States, as the pressure on George Bush, both at home and abroad, shows no sign of slowing down. Talking about America and the world, I'm delighted to be joined by the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. Madeleine, here in the UK, there's of course the hostage crisis which has gone around the world, the 15 British hostages, and with the words hostages and Tehran bring back memories, don't they, of back in 1979 and so on. What would you be doing now if you were in office, well, here?
Well, first of all, I think that we all have a great deal of compassion for the sailors that were captured and obviously for their families. And I do remember, unfortunately, the 79. I was in the White House with President Carter, and it was something that paralyzed our actions. I think what I would be doing now is exactly what the British government is doing, which is raising the stakes diplomatically and pushing for the release of the people. I am concerned, however, David, about the fact that there is so much saber rattling going on in terms of some of the carrier forces that we have in the region, and I'm very concerned about this escalating.
Yes, escalating into a new localized war.
Absolutely, because I know how easy it is to get into a military situation and how difficult it is to get out of it. And I'm afraid that it would inflame the region even more than it already is inflamed. And unfortunately, so much of this is a result of the war in Iraq, where one of the unintended consequences has been the increased influence and power of Iran.
That's absolutely true, and going back to that other one, SAS or special forces and so on, or commandos, probably wouldn't work, because if the hostages in Tehran, you've got to find other ways of doing it, haven't you?
Well, of course, maybe others in the government have information about where they are. I think obviously part of the problem is locating where they're being kept. And then how that would work. And then you go back to the problems that we had in '79 in rescuing hostages. But what I am particularly concerned about is with two carrier task force groups of the U.S. military in the Persian Gulf, and the Iranians at various times having military exercises, that some kind of an accident could happen in addition to whatever is being done on purpose. And so that is what is worrisome. And what I think should happen, David, is a suggestion that maybe a third party could be brought in order to look at the GPS that the British government is putting forward, which I happen to believe is undoubtedly correct, and then have there be a judgment by them. Perhaps the Russians could help in this regard.
That's a very important thought and a very important initiative. Let's hope something's done on that. Tell me, in terms of Iraq, which you mentioned, Madeleine, there, on Wednesday the Senate voted in favour of setting a deadline for withdrawal from Iraq, 31st of March 2008. What did you think of that?
Well, first of all, the Congress is reacting to the will of the American people. The election in November really was a watershed because people are seeing that the war in Iraq has been completely mismanaged and has brought a number of unintended consequences, as I mentioned earlier. And so a lot of this is being done out of frustration and representing the will of the people. What I think is useful is to look at a lot of the language that is in the Senate bill and understand that this is a goal to begin to get a strategic redeployment and a way to put some pressure on the government in Iraq to accept a more responsible role for getting their security forces into shape.
Yes, and President Bush said, of course, that the consequences of withdrawal would be disastrous for America. Do you think that's true?
Well, the tragedy here at the moment, David, is that there are no good options. And that, in fact, it's a disaster if we go and a disaster if we stay, because there's no coherent policy. And therefore, I think that it is important to figure out a way to have this strategic redeployment. And then something that I've been saying is that the United States did not begin World War I or World War II, but when we saw that it affected our national interest, our forces came in and it turned everything around. And I would hope that the Europeans and some of the countries in the region would understand that their national interest is being threatened by what is going on in Iraq, and that there would be more help in training up the Iraqis, and then obviously in reconstruction. This is now an international problem, no matter how it started.
Right, and you said last year, you said that, I hope I'm wrong, but Iraq could turn out to be the greatest disaster in American foreign policy, worse even than Vietnam. Does it still look that way to you?
Definitely. And, you know, I said that in a book that's just come out in paperback in the U.S. And you know, when you do predict something like that, you write it, and in many ways you think you're going to be right. And in this case, I hoped I was wrong. But I think I'm right, because not in terms of the number of Americans or British citizens that have died or Iraqis, but in terms of these unintended consequences in the region. The most complicated one, I think, being the influence of Iran, and then the kind of knock-on effect in terms of chaotic situations in a region that wasn't that stable in the first place.
Right. And in terms of that's in terms of Iraq and so on. The Middle East also, at the moment, of course, is in a confused state at the moment. You said on one occasion, I can't think of anything that's better than it was 5 years ago. Is that one? Would the Middle East be one of those examples in terms of our policies?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I do think that in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, we were on the verge when President Clinton left office of President Clinton put down a plan that has now been seen, I think, as a good template for what could happen in the area, but not enough attention was paid to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and one can't say that those talks are going particularly well now. I also am fascinated by some of the statements coming out of Saudi Arabia and the meeting of the Arab ministers that I think is making quite clear that the United States is not in a particularly good position in the region, and that the divisions between the Sunni and the Shia are very complicated, leading to what King Abdullah of Jordan has said, the potential of a real fight between the Arabs and the Persians.
Right, and in fact, Condi Rice said that she thought it was not inconceivable that there might be a peace deal between the Palestinians and Israel by the end of the year, or maybe she meant the end of next year. But anyway, in quite short order. Hopefully she's right, but there's a long way to go, isn't there?
Well, there definitely seems to be, because I think there has been not a way to see the coordinated effort between what is coming out of Riyadh and King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia and some of the steps that are being suggested for the Israeli-Palestinian talks. I think it would be great if that came together. Some of the ideas that King Abdullah has put forward that he did in 2002, I think could be developed in a way that they could reflect some of the needs both of the Israelis and the Palestinians, and then build on that. But at the moment, David, I think that what is the real issue is that any steps of confidence and trust between the Israelis and the Palestinians have been eroded in the last 6 years, and that is something that has to be rebuilt.
What about, for instance, Prime Minister Haniyeh? Would you talk to him in the current situation, or would you have to refuse to talk to him if you were in office?
Well, at the moment, it's the American law that one cannot talk to Hamas. But do you know what is interesting? And it fits in with the issue that we've all been talking about, the fact that that Northern Ireland all of a sudden has been able to move forward in terms of a power-sharing arrangement, and it's partially because the Irish split the IRA, the more violent part, away from Sinn Féin, the political part. And that is what we have been talking about and looking for in Hamas, that in fact there could be a division between those who continue to espouse violent actions and those who think that they could make peace with Israel. And that is a movement that I think we should try to encourage.
But at the moment you feel that the United States has lost the initiative in the Middle East, really?
Well, the United States, by law, cannot speak to Hamas. No. And President Abbas is a very, I think, remarkable figure and somebody that I've known and worked with a long time. But he needs to be strengthened. And Prime Minister Olmert, I read in the papers today that his ratings, his popularity ratings, are now within the margin of error, so low. And so you have two leaders that are not in a particularly good position to take some really affirmative and strong steps. And so I do think, I'm very glad that Secretary Rice has gone to the region. I'm glad that the powers in the region have an increased interest in it. But we are, in many ways, having to build up from the bottom again.
Right. What about North Korea? You're one of the few people in the world who's met Kim Jong-il. What do you think about the way things are at the moment? Do you think that they will stick to their word that they've said about sealing their nuclear weapons and so on?
Well, first of all, I do think it's unfortunate that I still have that dubious honor of being the highest level American official to meet with Kim Jong-il. And I think what has been missing again in the last 6 years is an American involvement in moving towards bilateral talks. I do think that Ambassador Christopher Hill has done a remarkable job in the last few weeks, and I hope very much that the North Koreans will stick with the agreements that they've made. But as you know, there's been a glitch or a hiccup in terms of one of the parts of the agreement, which is the release of the funds out of the bank so that the North Koreans can get their money. I hope that that will be straightened out, that it's just a technical issue, and that the other parts of the agreement can go forward. But again, the hiatus of the last 6 years has cost a lot. When we left office, we thought that the North Koreans had enough nuclear material to make 1 to 2 nuclear weapons. Now intelligence tells us that they might have enough to make 8 to 10 nuclear weapons. That's a very expensive cost for 6 years of lack of action.
Well, we've had a wonderful tour of the world in terms of looking at your perceptions around the world, and we're immensely grateful for that. You're in great form, and we say thanks a million for being with us, Madeleine.
Thanks so much for asking me, David. I always enjoy interviews with you. Thank you so very much.
Join me after this break when I'll be discussing the impact of this week's Arab League Summit.